On my 25th birthday, my parents took me to dinner to tell me I was adopted. Mom smiled. "We only kept you for the benefits, now you're not useful." Dad said they'd already filed to cut me out of everything. I didn't cry. I said, "Funny, I found my birth family 6 months ago. They're sitting 3 tables behind you." When Mom turned around slowly, she, "Welcome back. This is Quiet Drama Stories, where family secrets, betrayal, and revenge stories come alive. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share." Now let's start today's interesting story. My name is Paige Mercer, and I was 25 the night my parents took me to dinner to tell me I was adopted. The restaurant was called Vanterre, and I had never once been there in my life. My mother picked it. That should have been my first warning, because Diane Mercer did not spend money on me unless there was a reason already written into the receipt somewhere. She was wearing the gray cashmere she kept reserved for funerals and board meetings. My father, Wesley, had reserved the table under her name, not mine, which I noticed when the hostess asked, and he answered before I could speak. There was no banner, no balloon tied to my chair, no cake waiting in a back kitchen somewhere with my name written in blue icing. For what was supposed to be a birthday dinner, the table was oddly empty, and the space between my tarried, the careful politeness of people preparing to deliver a verdict. I had spent 4 years in rooms that felt like this. I booked tables like this for clients, for signings, for the quiet moments families share when someone has died and money needs to be moved. I knew the difference between dinner and deposition, and this had the temperature of a deposition. So I did what I always do when a room turns cold. I focused on my breathing and counted the exits. That was when I noticed the small brass number on the table behind us, and slightly to the left, table 9. I held it in my mind without fully knowing why, like a landmark you note before realizing you might need to find your way back. I placed my own item beside my water glass, a thin manila folder, plain and unassuming. My mother glanced at it and assumed it was a resume, or maybe a card. She had no idea what I had put inside it. You have to understand what birthdays meant in our house to understand why I wasn't surprised. When I was little, my birthday was 1 candle, not 1 candle as a tradition, like some families do with a single tall number, but 1 candle, pressed into a grocery store cupcake my mother picked up on the way home, and never bothered to refrigerate. I would watch it soften on the counter while she took calls. Meanwhile, 3 weeks later, my cousin Brett would get a rented bounce house and a catered one, spread with small quiches on silver trays, because Brett was my Aunt Renee's son, and Brett was blood. I remember asking when I was 8 if I could have a party too. My aunt was there drinking my mother's wine, and answered for her. "We can only do one nice thing a month, honey," she said it gently. That was the part that taught me the most. How kindness can sound while it's explaining your place in the hierarchy. So I learned the math. 1 cupcake costs less than a party. A child who asks for less is cheaper than a child who asks for the same. By the time I was 9, I stopped asking for cake because I could see it made the calculation easier for everyone at the table, and being easy felt like the only value I had. I never told myself it was sad. I told myself it was efficient. That's the reality of growing up useful. You don't realize you've been priced until someone speaks the number out loud. And across that white tablecloth at Vanterre, 25 years old, I could feel my mother preparing to do exactly that. I left that house the week I turned 18, with 2 duffel bags and a community college acceptance I had filled out myself. No one drove me. I worked nights at a pharmacy counter, and went to classes in the morning, then transferred to a state school, and completed a paralegal program while waiting tables on weekends. I paid for all of it. I want that to be clear, not because it makes me special, but because it matters for what came later. No one gave me anything. By 25, I was a paralegal at a trusts and estates firm downtown. And I was good at it. I spent my days inside other people's wealth, organizing what happens to a life after the person can no longer hold on to it. I drafted the quiet pages that decide everything: beneficiary designations, distribution schedules, the calm language that determines who receives and who doesn't, long after the funeral has passed. I could read a trust the way some people read a face. And the irony of my life, the one I didn't find funny for years, was this. I could build a perfect boundary for a stranger. I could tell a grieving widow exactly what she was entitled to, and exactly what she was not. But I could not, for anything, ask my own family to want me. The only person I ever called was my grandmother. Every Sunday at 4 o'clock, like clockwork, all through college and after, Nana Ruth. She was the one Mercer who answered the phone like she had been waiting for it to ring. And it was something Nana once said to me that ended up being the hinge everything that night turned on. Nana Ruth Mercer was my father's mother, and she was the only adult in that family who ever made me feel like a person instead of an accounting entry. She had opinions about everything, and apologies for nothing. When I was 12 and crying in her kitchen because Brett had told me I wasn't a real Mercer, she put down her dish towel, lifted my chin in her hand, and said the line I carried for the next 13 years. You were chosen, sweetheart, not collected. Then she made me a grilled cheese and let me stay up too late. Nana died when I was 23. 2 years before that dinner, I was the only one who gave a eulogy that spoke about who she was instead of what she left behind. And within a month of the funeral, my parents quietly moved out of their small split-level home and into the larger house on Linden Road, the one that had been in the family for a long time, the one tied to Nana's name in ways I understood better than they realized. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was grieving, but there was something Nana told me on one of our last Sundays, her voice faint over the phone, that I had stored away without fully understanding. She made sure I understood, that I would never have to ask anyone for my own life. I thought she meant it as encouragement. A grandmother telling a granddaughter to be strong. It would be 6 months before that dinner, while going through county records for an entirely different reason, that I learned she had meant it literally, in writing and notarized. The year before I turned 25, my family began growing quiet around me, and not in the comfortable way. Messages that used to be answered within an hour now took 3 days. My mother stopped including me in the holiday planning chain, then acted surprised when I showed up to Thanksgiving without a side dish no one had asked me to bring. My Aunt Renee, meanwhile, grew louder. She had started using a word in the family group chat she had never bothered with before. Blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake. As in, the cabin sleeps 8, and we want to keep it to blood this year. You understand? I did understand. I understood completely. I just didn't yet have the documents to explain why the temperature had shifted so suddenly, all at once, in the same season. People don't usually turn cold on a schedule. Families drift, yes, but this wasn't drift. This was coordinated, and the analyst part of my mind kept flagging it. The way you notice 3 unrelated invoices, arriving on the same Tuesday, and realize they are not unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening in March with my mother's name and a voice 3 degrees warmer than it had been in a year, I didn't feel flattered. I felt the small, cold click of a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. Honey, she said. She only called me honey when she wanted something. We'd like to take you out to properly celebrate 25, the way we never quite managed. And every instinct I had built in 4 years of reading other people's bad news told me the same thing. This is too neat. Here is what most people misunderstand about my mother. They think the cruelty is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is the planning. The cruelty is a woman who never once managed a birthday cake, suddenly reserving a corner table at Vontaire, and calling it properly celebrating you. When Diane gets generous, it is because a spreadsheet somewhere has told her the generosity will pay for itself. I had seen it my whole life. I had just never been the line item before. So I said yes, sweetly, the way she taught me. And then I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time doing what I do. I thought about timelines. I thought about the house on Linden Road. I thought about the word blood appearing in the group chat exactly now, exactly this season, and about a sentence my grandmother had said to me before she died. And I thought about the manila folder already in my work bag, the one I had assembled 6 months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother, and everything to do with finally knowing where I came from. I didn't call my parents back with questions. I didn't warn them I had been to the county clerk. Instead, I made a few calls of my own, quiet ones, the kind you make when you've decided you are not going to be ambushed. You are going to be ready. I won't tell you yet who I called, but I will tell you the rule I live by, the one Nana never said out loud but taught me anyway. When my mother is sweet, someone at the table is about to lose something. I just made sure this time it wouldn't be me. People assume a story like this is about money, and I understand why. There is a will somewhere, a house. A folder slid across a table, but sitting in my car in the Vontaire parking lot that night, engine off, hands steady on the wheel, what I was afraid of losing had no dollar amount. I was afraid of losing the last belief that I had ever belonged anywhere. Because as cold as that house had been, as transactional as every candle and casserole, it was still the only origin story I had. They were still technically my parents. And if they cut that thread tonight the way I suspected they intended to, then I would be exactly what Brett had called me at 12. Not a real Mercer, just a girl someone picked up and put down. That was the wound they were aiming for, and they knew it, because it was the wound they had pressed on my whole life. What they didn't account for was that the wound had already closed. 6 months can do that if the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder under my arm, and walked across that lot with the particular calm of a woman who has already read the last page of a book everyone else believes is still being written. I wasn't going to a disownment. I was going to a goodbye I had already chosen. They just didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anyone said anything true. My mother praised the wine list. My father talked about parking he had already mentioned in the car. And then somewhere between the bread and the entree no one would end up eating. Diane folded her hands and shifted into the voice. I know that voice. It's the one she used when she once returned a Christmas gift in front of me, and explained why it hadn't been practical. We've always done our very best for you, she began. Wesley nodded along, half a beat behind her, the same way he had followed her nod for 30 years. We gave you a roof, an education, more than some children ever get. I let her speak. I kept one hand flat on the manila folder beside my plate, and I saw my father's eyes flick down to it before pulling away. The tab had a label on it, typed, with only the top edge visible above my fingers. He could make out 4 letters if he looked, and he looked, too. I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it, only to let him wonder, and I watched the wondering take hold of him. My mother continued about sacrifices, about how a child should understand the cost of being raised, and I thought of a sweating cupcake and a single candle, and said nothing. Then she paused, took a small sip, placed the glass down with the precision of a woman landing on a practiced slide, and said the line that opened everything. There's something, Paige, that you should have been told a very long time ago. You're adopted, my mother said. She said it like she was changing a dinner reservation. We adopted you when you were an infant. You were never biologically ours. I want you to know, we never planned to keep this from you forever. She watched my face as she spoke, and I understood she was waiting for collapse. This was the moment she had built the evening around, the corner table, the cashmere, the rehearsed pauses, all engineered to arrive here, where her adopted daughter learned she had been a stranger all along, and would break apart in pieces she could later sweep away. I would love to say it didn't land. It did. Some part of a person always braces for the floor to be there, and mine had just been told there was no floor. But I had already had 6 months to know this, and the only thing my mother revealed was how little she understood me. She leaned in, almost softly, and delivered the sentence I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. We only kept you for the benefits. She smiled as she said it. That was what freed me in the end, not the cruelty itself. I had grown up on the cruelty. The smile. A woman does not smile while delivering the worst news of your life unless she has rehearsed it enough times to enjoy the timing. And in that smile, I saw the full shape of it. I hadn't been a daughter who disappointed them. I had been an asset that had stopped appreciating. Benefits is a clean word for a dirty arrangement, and my father, to his discredit, tried to explain it like an accountant defending a position. There were assistance payments in the early years, Wesley said, still not meeting my eyes. The adoption came with a small monthly subsidy when you were little, but that ended a long time ago, when you were still in grade school. There were tax considerations after that, and there was your grandmother, of course. Though he didn't say her name like that. He said Nana had expectations about family, but adopting me helped them meet those expectations, and that meeting them had become, in his careful accountant's phrasing, worthwhile for a good many years. I sat very still, and watched the arithmetic of my childhood rearrange itself into its real equation. A single cupcake, the hand-me-downs from Brett, still bearing Renee's return tags. The way the heat was turned down in my room first. They hadn't been poor, they had been keeping the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates. And I had been the generator. We invested in you, Wesley said, as though that settled it. As though a child were a rental property with a depreciation schedule. Then my mother, impatient with his bookkeeping, cut to the line beneath everything else, the one the entire evening had been designed to deliver. The subsidy has been gone since you were a child, Paige, and what comes after it ends today. You're 25 now. There's simply nothing further that keeping you around does for us. She said it almost regretfully, like noting an expired coupon. Now you're not useful. 2 sentences that reduced a quarter-century of being their daughter into a line that no longer produced value. I reached for my water. My hand didn't shake. I noticed that it didn't, and I stored it away as a small, unexpected gift. Then my father did what he had come to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he had brought, which I had assumed held a birthday card, and slid a thin stack of papers across the tablecloth until it touched my plate. "We've already filed," he said, "to formalize things. You won't be in the will. You won't be a beneficiary of anything. We wanted to do this cleanly, in person, so there would be no confusion later." He had rehearsed cleanly. I could hear the lawyer who had coached him in it. And here is what my family has never understood. The part that changed the night without me saying a word. I read the caption on the first page in about 4 seconds, the way I have read 1,000 others. And I saw immediately what they had done. They had filed against the wrong instrument. They had spent good money cutting me out of an estate that was almost irrelevant, while leaving untouched the document that actually controlled everything. They didn't know what I knew. They thought the power in that room ran through their modest will. So that was where they aimed their expensive little knife. I didn't correct them. You don't tell the other side they've sued the wrong defendant. You let them finish. So I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor refusing, and I let them believe they had won. Across the table, my Aunt Renee's voice came through my mother's purse on speakerphone, because of course Renee was listening, because Renee had been the architect of much of this. "Blood looks after blood, Paige," she said, warm as a knife in soup. "You've always understood that." I didn't cry. I want to be honest that part of me expected to, that some 12-year-old version of me still, living somewhere in my chest, had been braced for this table since the night Brett told her she wasn't real. But the 25-year-old me simply took a slow sip of water and set the glass down without a sound. And I watched something move across my mother's face that I had never genuinely seen there before. Disappointment. Not at me, but at the performance. She had written this scene with a sobbing girl in the lead role, and the girl wasn't sobbing, and it was breaking her ending. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked. And there was an edge to it now, the brittle sound of a woman whose script had gone off track. I considered the question. I considered everything I could have said, the entire flood of it, 25 years backed up behind a single small dam. And then she made the mistake people like her always make. She filled the silence by returning to the line that had worked the first time, expecting it to work again. "We only kept you for the benefits," she repeated, slower this time, pressing into each word, trying to draw blood she could see. But a sentence loses its teeth the second time you hear it from the same mouth. The first time, it had been a revelation. The second time, it was only a confession, and not about me. It told me everything about her, and nothing about my worth. I placed my napkin in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her watch me not break. Behind her, at table 9, I saw a woman with my exact chin turn her head toward our table and go still. To explain what was in my folder, I have to go back 6 months, to the week 2 envelopes arrived and changed the entire arithmetic of my life. The first one I had been waiting for. After Nana died, I finally registered with the State Adoption Reunion Registry, half convinced nothing would come of it. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful, looping, the hand of a woman who had practiced what she needed to say. It was from Susan Hale. She wrote that she had been 19 when she gave me up, that she had not wanted to. She had thought about me every March for 25 years, and that if I ever wanted to meet her, she would drive any distance, any day, with no expectations. She signed it, and beneath her name she added one more line, the one I read over and over, until the paper softened. "I never stopped saving you a seat." The second envelope arrived 3 days later, and it had nothing to do with Susan, or so I thought. Our state had only recently opened original birth records to adult adoptees, available once you turned 21, and filed through the same reunion registry, and I submitted my request the same week Susan's letter arrived. While I was in the county system waiting for mine, I requested Nana's estate file. Professional habit, the way a dentist studies strangers' teeth. And there it was in the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, executed 2 years before her death, and administered not by my parents but by a bank. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer, it stated, would terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, at which point the remainder would pass to my granddaughter Paige, into her estate, under a trustee they could not touch, set to leave their control forever, on the exact date they had chosen for that dinner. 2 envelopes in 1 week. One told me where I came from, the other told me, in my grandmother's notarized hand, exactly what my parents were about to lose, and why they were suddenly in such a hurry. I did not call my mother to scream the discovery into the phone. That was not the weapon I had, and it was not the weapon I trusted. I had seen too many families lose everything to a satisfying outburst a lawyer later turns into evidence. What I had was process, so I used process. I took a personal day, drove the trust documents to an estate's attorney with no connection to my family, and paid her from my own savings to confirm what I already suspected. The caregiver distributions were real, ongoing, and ending. My parents had been receiving a monthly sum for raising me and living in the house the trust funded for nearly 2 decades. The remainder, on my 25th birthday, would pass to me under the trust's own terms through a corporate trustee, with nothing my parents could file, sign, or destroy to stop it. Their will was irrelevant. Their disownment was theater performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked if I wanted to notify them, to get ahead of it, to soften the landing. I said no. I said I wanted 3 things in a folder, and nothing more. The retainer letter so they would know I had counsel, the trust distribution schedule so they would see the date in black and white, and my original birth certificate with Susan Hale's name in the mother line, so that when the moment came, the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to leave, and which one I was choosing to keep. I labeled the tab, closed the folder, placed it in my bag, and carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I had not yet started. The dinner invitation only told me when to turn the key. I met Susan Hale for the first time in a diner halfway between our cities, because she did not want me to drive too far. That small consideration undid me more than any speech could have. She was nervous. She brought a photo album she kept opening and closing without showing me, as if she wasn't sure she had earned the right. She had my chin, and my habit of going quiet when things felt like too much. Over 6 months, we built something carefully, like repairing a bridge while standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother named Danny, 20, all elbows and questions, who texted memes within a week of meeting me, as though I had always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, fierce woman named Pearl, who looked at me once and said, "Well, there she is," as if I had simply been late, not gone for 25 years. They never asked me for anything. That was what my nervous system couldn't immediately understand. No requests, no money, no role to perform. Susan told me, the 3rd time we met, the thing that became the truest line of my life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart," she said. "We never gave it to anyone else." And I, who could draft a perfect beneficiary clause for a stranger, who knew the exact legal language of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and didn't know what to do, with my own hands, because I had been wanted for the first time by people who gained nothing from wanting me. After 25 years of being useful, I had no idea how to simply be welcome. I was about to have to learn fast. There is a difference between being needed and being wanted, and I had only ever known one of them. Being needed, I understood completely. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you stay easy, you keep the math simple, and in return, you get to keep your seat another quarter. I had been needed my whole life, and I had mistaken the steadiness of it for love, the way you can mistake a long commute for a destination simply because you do it every day. What Susan and Danny and Pearl offered me had no job attached, and that terrified me more than my mother ever had. The first time Susan called just to ask how my week was, with no agenda underneath it, I waited the entire conversation for the catch. And when there wasn't one, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see the road. I kept testing them in small, ungenerous ways I'm not proud of. I would cancel plans just to see if they would punish me. They didn't. They simply said, "No worries, next time," and meant it. I would offer to pay for everything, to make myself useful, to earn the seat. Pearl finally took my face in her hands the way Nana used to and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." And slowly, over those 6 months, a knot I had carried since I was 9, began not to disappear, to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of evidence, that a person could simply want me in the room. So when my mother called to invite me to properly celebrate 25, I already knew where I wanted to spend the evening. I just decided to spend it everywhere at once. Here is who I called. The night my mother booked Van Ter, I called Susan and asked her a question I had been too afraid to ask anyone in my life. Did you come to my birthday dinner? I explained the entire shape of it. The parents, the suspicions, the trust, the speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone. And I knew I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were counting on. Susan didn't hesitate for even a second. What time and where? And should we dress up? Then she said something that made me cover my mouth in my kitchen. We'd be honored, she said, to watch you not need them. So I made one more call, this time to Van Ter, and booked a second table for the same evening under my own name. Paige Mercer, party of 3. Table 9, the host told me. Near the back, 3 tables behind the reservation already on the said. Books for a Mercer party of 3 at the front. I almost laughed at the geometry of it. They had no idea they would be performing my disownment within sight of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a seat. I told Susan and Pearl and Danny to arrive a little after us, to order quietly, to simply be there, and to let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There is a reason truth lands harder spoken in front of witnesses than mailed in a letter, and I had seen enough confrontations to know a private one only becomes the other side's word against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I'm not ashamed of it. But Susan and Pearl and Danny were never only witnesses to me, and that was the entire difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I would make my parents understand they had lost. Table 9 was where I would go to remember I had already won long before they sat down. Back at the front table in the present, my mother decided the silence had gone on long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio and turned it toward me, uncapping a pen and placing it across the paper like a small gift. It's just an acknowledgement, she said, that we've informed you, that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner and go our separate ways. I looked at the page, and I didn't have to read far. The release paragraph began with the exact boilerplate I had typed 100 times myself. The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy, and the rest did what that language always does. It wasn't an acknowledgement, it was a waiver, dressed as one. A clean little document, designed so I would agree on record that I had been notified and had no claim. The kind of thing a careful lawyer drafts to prevent exactly the challenge I was positioned to make. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the reveal, before the shock wore off, and I could think. It's a classic move. I've seen grieving people sign away fortunes at kitchen tables because someone slid a pen across at the right wounded moment. My mother was counting on my wound. She didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen where it lay. My father, across from me, kept glancing at my manila folder, and I watched worry rise up his neck in a slow red tide. Wesley had always been the one who knew where the money actually lived. He had seen the 4 letters on the tab. He was doing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I had done 6 months earlier, and I could tell the answer was starting to scare him. Is there? He began, then stopped. Is there something we should know, Paige? I smiled at him, the first real smile of the night. Not yet, I said. That was when my Aunt Renee arrived in person, with Brett trailing behind her, both of them feigning the surprise of people who had been waiting in the bar for a text. Paige, what a coincidence, Renee said, pressing a cold cheek to mine. And I understood immediately that Diane had summoned reinforcements. My mother liked an audience for her best work, and she especially liked one that would nod along and apply pressure if I became difficult. Renee pulled up a chair without asking. Brett, 26, and still dressed like his mother bought his clothes, gave me the same look I had received since we were children. The look that said I had always been headed for the kids' terminal eventually. Renee went straight to it, because subtlety was never her instrument. We just want what's best for the family, she said, placing a manicured hand over my mother's. And families have to make hard choices about who is really part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Paige. You understand that blood looks after blood. There it was again. That word, the one she had been dropping into the group chat all year, finally spoken aloud at the table it had been built for. I looked at my aunt, who had spoken for my mother the day I was 8, and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party. And I felt the last thread of obligation inside me go slack. These were not people I was losing. These were people I was setting down. I'd carried them a long way, longer than they deserved, and my arms were finally, gloriously tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in. He was staring down at his hands. And then, while Renee was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, Wesley leaned toward me and said something low, just for me. "Your grandmother loved you," my father said very quietly beneath Renee's chatter, and then he stopped. For a moment, I saw an entirely different version of Wesley Mercer, the one who might have existed if he had ever once chosen the harder thing over the comfortable one. His eyes were wet. He had loved his mother, that much I knew was true, and some part of him understood that the woman he had loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she did not trust her son to protect me. That had to be a terrible thing to sit with at a dinner table. I waited. I genuinely waited, because there was a version of that night where my father said the next sentence, the apology, the "I'm sorry, this is wrong, I won't do this," and I would have heard it, and it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother instead, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that has wandered toward the road, and I saw him choose. He leaned back. He picked up his water, and the almost sentence died in his throat, where so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me all night, and it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you always knew he was. But I finally understood that the reason they had filed so quickly, the reason for the whole rushed, cruel evening, was sitting behind his wet eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He had known the date was coming, and he had desperately hoped to get my signature on a waiver before I ever learned what his mother had done for me. So I asked him a question, not loudly, not as a daughter. I used the voice I use at the firm when I found the flaw in someone's filing and I mine, giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. "Dad," I said, "which instrument did you file under, your estate or Nana's trust?" The table went quiet in a different way. My mother's wineglass paused halfway to her mouth. Renee's manicured hand stopped mid-gesture. Wesley blinked at me like I had started speaking a language he half recognized from a country he had never visited, because in 8 words I had told them 3 things they hadn't budgeted for, that I knew there was a difference, that I knew which one mattered, and that I had known long enough to learn the vocabulary cold. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I had always been the quiet one, the easy one, the girl who took the smaller slice so the table could stay pleasant. They had built this entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate, not audit it. "What?" my mother said, and it came out smaller than she intended. "What are you talking about?" I let the question sit. I've learned the most powerful person in any room is the one who doesn't sure that you need to rush to the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, aligned it with the edge of the manila folder, and looked at my father, who had gone very pale and already knew, and who was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. I didn't make a performance of it. No flourish, no slammed documents, no speech. I simply turned the folder so it faced them, and laid the 3 pages out on the white cloth side by side, the way I would lay exhibits before a client who needed to understand their own case. First, the retainer letter, with the firm's letterhead and the unmistakable line confirming I was represented by counsel. Second, the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, the relevant paragraph already visible in black and white. And third, my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name, where my mother had assumed her own belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let paper do what paper does. My mother's eyes went to the trust schedule first, because of course they did, because some animal part of her had always known where the money slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words land. "Caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Paige." I watched her reach remainder and Paige, and I watched the color drain from her face from the top down, like a blind being pulled. She looked up at me, then at Wesley, then back at the page. The way people do when they're hoping the second reading will be kinder than the first. It wasn't. It never is, Mom, I said gently, because I could afford gentleness now. You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of was always the smaller one. My mother was quick. I'll give her that. Even so, It took her about 10 seconds to assemble the full picture, and I watched it happen in real time. The house on Linden Road, funded by the trust she had assumed she would live in forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly sustained her comfortable life, ending by their own terms that night. The remainder, the real money, the part she had spent 2 decades orbiting but never controlling, passing on this exact date to the daughter she had just declared finished with. And the waiver, her clever little waiver I had nearly signed, worth precisely nothing, because it released a claim against an estate that was never where the value lived. She had aimed every weapon she had at a will, and missed the trust entirely. The cruelty had been free, the mistake was not. And here is what I learned then. The last lesson my mother had ever been positioned to teach me. People like her do not apologize when they are caught. They pivot. Her expression shifted, the cold draining out, and something warm, something performed, flooding in. She reached across the table for my hand. "Paige," she said, her voice soft, wet, maternal in a way it had never been when it cost her anything. "We're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers, that doesn't change what we are. We're family." The word family, from the mouth that 20 minutes earlier had said, "We only kept you for the benefits." I looked at her hand reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The same sentence that had once been her weapon was now, in this light, the confession that cleared the path for me to leave. People expect this is where I made them pay, where I explained exactly what the remainder was worth, watched them unravel, maybe ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, and left them with the bill. I understand the appetite for it. I've had it myself. I want to tell you the truth about power, because I handle it for a living. The strongest position in any room isn't the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't need the number at all. I had a career I built with my own hands. I had savings I earned waiting tables and drafting documents. I did not need Nana's remainder to be free. More than any dollar figure, that was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back into it, unhurried, and I placed the pen they had brought for my surrender neatly beside her plate. I had already won what they thought we were fighting over before any of them had sat down. And I had won it by knowing, by preparing, by refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue, only the choice of where to spend the rest of my birthday. And I had made that choice 6 months ago in a vinyl diner booth, when a nervous woman with my chin slid a photo album across a table, and didn't ask me for a single thing. I administer estates for a living, and I'll tell you what I tell every client who is being circled by people who only appear when prover. If someone in your life shows up only when you are useful, you already know what that is. And no amount of shared history turns it into love. Type the word boundaries below if you've had to learn that the hard way. And subscribe because the part you came for is about to happen. I stood up. The way you rise from any table, no drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate. My mother's hand was still suspended in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said, and the soft maternal mask slipped away as the old, cold control snapped back into her voice like a bone setting. "Sit down, Paige. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Renee straightened. Brett, for once, stopped smirking. My father just looked tired. The look of a man watching the only good thing his mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder and held it to my chest. And I looked at my mother, who had spent 25 years at expensive dinners trying to convince me I had no real place anywhere. And I told her where I was going, in the plainest words I had. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true the entire meal. True while she smiled and rehearsed and slid her waiver across the cloth. True all along. She believed she was performing my disownment for an audience of strangers. She had not been performing it for strangers. She had been performing it within arm's reach of the people who had been saving me a chair since, before she ever decided I had stopped being useful. And I watched my words cross the table and land. I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn in her seat. She turned the way you turn, when some part of you already knows, and is begging the rest of you to be wrong. Her cashmere shoulders rotated, her chin followed, and there at table 9, 3 tables back, under the warm low light, were Susan and Pearl, and Danny. They had been there the entire time. They had ordered quietly, eaten almost nothing, and watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my life, holding their seats and their composure, because I had asked them to let me come to them. Susan met my mother's eyes first. No glare, no triumph. Just the steady look of a woman seeing the person who had raised her daughter on one candle and a calculator. Then she looked at me, and her whole face opened like a window in spring. Pearl, small and ferocious, already had her napkin folded beside her plate, ready. Danny had stopped pretending to check his phone. My mother's gaze moved from Susan's face to mine, and back again, doing the resemblance math. And I saw the exact moment she understood that the family she had just told me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her, in real chairs, at a real table, having witnessed her say the one thing she could never take back, in front of people she didn't even know were there. She turned back to me, her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. And in the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped back at table 9. They stood up, 3 of them. Not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, just to be on their feet. When I crossed the room the way you stand for someone arriving at a gate after a long flight. Pearl stood first, because Pearl always does everything first, then Susan, then Danny, knocking his knee against the table in his haste. They didn't speak to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said everything. The restaurant had gone quiet in that particular way. Strangers go quiet when they can feel something real happening, and stop pretending not to watch. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray, and I walked past my mother, still half-turned in her chair, past Renee, whose mouth had finally run out of blood, past my father, who looked up at me as I passed and then looked away again, choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet, 3 tables, 25 years. When I reached them, Pearl took my face in both hands the way Nana used to, and Susan pulled out the empty chair beside hers, the 4th chair, the one she had asked the host to add even though their reservation was for 3. And she said the words she had written under her name in that first letter, the words that had gone soft from how often I had read them. "We saved you a seat," she said. "We always did." And I sat in it, in the seat that had been waiting my whole life, at the table that had wanted me, before it even knew I would come. That was when my mother lost the one thing she had never lost in front of people, her composure. Her chair scraped back. She stood, the calm front she had worn all evening split clean down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, no longer quiet, her voice carrying across the dining room. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years, you do this to us in public? You humiliate your family over money?" Heads turned openly now. A man at the bar set his drink down. Renee tugged at her sleeve, hissing, "Diane, sit down. People are looking." But my mother was past her own handler for the first time in her life, because the script was gone. All she had left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said to the room. And I noticed she said gave, not loved. Even now, even cornered, the word love would not come, because it had never been in the inventory. I stayed seated at table 9. I didn't stand to match her. I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. Susan's hand found mine under the table, and I held it while my mother became loud, because the loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant was watching the same thing, a calm young woman seated quietly with people who clearly adored her, and a furious older woman shouting about everything she had paid for. And there is not a human being alive who hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, that is the real family. My father never stood at all. He just put his face in his hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain, and when the quiet returned, I did one last thing before I gave the rest of my attention to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back to the front, and placed a single page on the white cloth in front of her. The trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on the longest evening of her life. "You can keep this one," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today, and what didn't." She stared at the page. Wesley reached for it, then stopped, and I looked at both of them. My mother, who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father, who had loved his own mother too much to ignore what she had asked of him. And I said the only sentence I had prepared in advance, the one I had written in my head in the parking lot, and decided I would only use if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits," I said. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned around and walked back to table 9, and I did not look back again. Not once. Not when Renee called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear and didn't want to. I sat down beside Susan, Pearl had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake while I was gone, and Danny had stuck a small restaurant candle into it, a single lit flame. For 1 second, the symmetry caught in my throat. Then Susan leaned in and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make the wish." And I realized I didn't have one. I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother built it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer ended on the date, and by the terms Nana had notarized 2 years before she died. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, untouched by the will my parents had spent good money revising, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you do not control. Their unsigned waiver was worth what it had always been worth. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Linden Road because, without the distributions, they could not maintain it, and moved into something smaller. And I am told Renee was furious to learn that none of Nana's money would be flowing to Brett after all. The story of that dinner traveled the way these stories do, through the family, and then beyond it. The version in which Diane Mercer is the devoted mother, wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter, never fully took, because too many strangers at Van Ter had watched a woman scream about everything she had paid for, while a quiet girl held hands with the family across the room. I didn't sue anyone, I didn't post anything, I simply stopped responding and let silence be the boundary, the only kind that ever holds. My father texted me once a few weeks later, 3 words, "I am sorry." No name, no follow-up. When I didn't reply, I never replied. I later heard that when Renee tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Wesley who quietly shut it down, telling them their mother had every right to leave her money where she pleased, that it was hers, that it was finished. He was right. He was also, as always, a year too late, and saying it in the wrong room, when it cost him nothing and changed nothing. That was the whole of my father in the end. A man who knew the right thing, even felt it, and could only bring himself to do it once. Doing it no longer required anything of him. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad, in a small, clean way, that he had finally been right out loud. As for the rest, I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 9 with people who gained nothing from wanting me, and I have spent every birthday since with them. Susan and I talk every Sunday now at 4 o'clock, the hour I used to save for Nana. Pearl taught me how to make her grilled cheese. Danny still sends memes. And somewhere in a drawer in my new family's kitchen, there is a photo album that no longer closes because it finally has enough pages. Being useful was all my parents ever wanted from me, and being wanted was the one thing I had never had. And it took me 25 years and one terrible dinner to learn that anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you, in the plainest language possible, that they were never your family at all. That's my story. 1 candle for 24 years. And on the 25th, a whole table that lit them all without being asked. If someone in your life only values you when you are useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You do not have to earn the people who love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.